Mercedes may have just walked into Monaco with the most dangerous advantage in Formula One. Not a faster wing. Not a secret suspension. Not even a normal engine upgrade. Something far harder to see, and much harder to punish. A tiny change inside the engine may have allowed Mercedes to pass the FIA checks at 16-1, then behave closer to 18-1 when the heat rises. And now, just before Monaco, the FIA has found new evidence that could expose whether this was genius, a loophole, or the biggest regulatory failure of the new era. Because if Mercedes really kept even a small part of that power advantage, then Ferrari, Honda, Audi, and Red Bull have not just been chasing lap time. They have been chasing a rule that may have been broken without technically being broken. And the most important part is this: Monaco is not just another race. It is the first real test of whether the FIA has finally closed the door, or accidentally confirmed that Mercedes was one step ahead the entire time. Subscribe to the channel. At first, the Mercedes story sounds like a simple engine controversy. A team finds a clever trick. The rivals get angry. The FIA steps in. But that version is too clean, and it misses the part that makes this so dangerous. Because this was not about one mechanic turning a screw in a secret corner of the garage. It was not about a hidden button. It was not about something obvious that inspectors could point at and immediately ban. It was about temperature. And in Formula One, temperature is never just temperature. It changes tires. It changes brakes. It changes batteries. It changes fuel behavior. It changes the way a car breathes, the way it survives, and in this case, possibly the way an engine defines legality itself. That is why Mercedes' alleged advantage became so difficult to attack. When an engine is cold, metal sits still. It has one shape, one size, one measurable state. That is the version inspectors can examine when the car is not under full racing stress. But when the engine is hot, everything changes. The metal expands. The clearances shrink. The internal geometry moves by tiny amounts that sound meaningless to normal people, but in Formula One, tiny is everything. A fraction of a millimeter can separate a legal idea from a scandal. A few degrees can separate a normal engine from a political war. And a missing sentence in the rulebook can separate fairness from fury. The key phrase here is compression ratio. It sounds complicated, but it is actually easy to understand. Inside the engine, air and fuel are squeezed before they burn. The more tightly that mixture is squeezed, the more energy the engine can usually extract from it. Think of it like pressing down on a spring. If you barely press it, the release is weak. If you press it hard, the release hits with force. That is the basic idea. More compression can mean more efficiency, more punch, and more power. And that is exactly why the FIA tried to control it. The new rules were supposed to set the limit at 16-1. Not 18-1. Not close to 18-1. 16-1. That number was meant to protect the balance of the new era. It was meant to stop established manufacturers from carrying old advantages into a fresh regulation cycle. It was meant to give Ferrari, Honda, Audi, Red Bull, and Mercedes a common line that nobody could cross. But here is where the whole story twists. According to the source material, the rule limited the geometric compression ratio, but the controversy began because the measurement conditions were not clearly nailed down. And that tiny gap opened a massive door. Because if you measure an engine cold, it may sit exactly at 16-1. Perfectly legal. Perfectly clean. Perfectly defensible. But if that same engine heats up under real running conditions, and specific materials expand in a carefully calculated way, the internal space inside the combustion chamber can become smaller. And when that space becomes smaller, the compression effectively rises. Suddenly, the engine that looked legal in the garage may behave closer to the old 18-1 level when it is alive on track. That is the part rivals could not ignore. Because Mercedes did not need to hide something from the FIA. Mercedes may have shown the FIA exactly what the rule asked to see. The cold engine. The legal engine. The version that passed. But the real race is not driven at room temperature. The real race happens when the engine is hot, stressed, and operating in the conditions where performance is actually won. And that is why the paddock reaction became so intense. Ferrari, Honda, Audi, and Red Bull were not just looking at Mercedes and thinking, they found power. They were looking at Mercedes and thinking, they found a version of legality we cannot reach in time. That is a much bigger problem. Because if a team simply discovers horsepower, rivals can chase it. If a team discovers a legal loophole late in development, rivals may be trapped. The engine architecture is already fixed. The materials are already chosen. The production process is already moving. The reliability tests have already been done. You cannot copy this kind of solution overnight. It is not like changing a rear wing angle. It is not like bringing a new floor edge. It is not even like adjusting cooling louvres. This lives deep inside the power unit, in places teams spend years designing before a single car reaches the track. And that is where the emotional pressure starts to build. Because the other manufacturers had to ask themselves a brutal question. Did Mercedes beat them with better engineering, or did Mercedes beat them because the FIA left a door unlocked? That question is dangerous because both answers hurt. If it was better engineering, Mercedes looks brilliant. If it was a regulatory failure, the FIA looks exposed. And if it was both, then the rest of the grid has a problem far bigger than one Grand Prix. This is why Monaco matters so much. Not because Monaco is the perfect place to use engine power. It is not. Monaco is narrow, slow, and punishing. Drivers spend the lap brushing walls, fighting traction, and trying to place the car with impossible precision. On paper, a compression advantage should matter more at circuits with long straights. But Monaco is important for another reason. Monaco arrives at the moment when the FIA's new checks are supposed to begin changing the story. This is where the controversy moves from whispers and legal arguments into measurement. Cold checks are no longer enough. Hot verification enters the picture. And once the FIA starts looking at the engine in a hotter state, the central question finally becomes unavoidable. Was Mercedes' advantage truly removed, or simply forced to become harder to detect? That question is what makes the entire weekend feel heavier. Because every Mercedes lap will now carry two meanings. There is the sporting meaning. How fast is the car? How comfortable is the driver? How strong is the setup? But beneath that, there is the political meaning. Has the engine lost something? Did the FIA really close the loophole? Are the rivals finally seeing the gap shrink? Or has Mercedes already adapted, arrived with a Monaco-ready specification, and protected the core of its advantage while still passing the new test? That is the nightmare scenario for everyone else. Not that Mercedes ignores the FIA. Not that Mercedes fails inspection. But that Mercedes passes, stays competitive, and turns the whole scandal into proof that it was always just smarter than the rest. And if that happens, Ferrari, Honda, Audi, and Red Bull will face an uncomfortable reality. They may have won the argument late. But Mercedes may have won the early season when it mattered most. That is the hidden damage of a loophole. It does not need to last forever. It only needs to last long enough to shape the championship. A few races of extra power can change points. A few points can change pressure. A shift in pressure can change strategy, confidence, development choices, and the emotional direction of a season. That is why this story cannot be reduced to a technical footnote. It reaches into everything. It affects how rivals trust the rulebook. It affects how teams interpret every new regulation. It affects how the FIA writes future measurements. And it affects how fans judge what they are watching. Because once people believe a car may have been legal only because the measurement was incomplete, every result becomes complicated. A win no longer feels like just a win. A straight line advantage no longer feels like just good design. A strong qualifying lap no longer feels clean in the eyes of everyone. And this is the point Mercedes rivals understood immediately. The fight was never only about 18-1. It was about who controls the definition of legal. The FIA writes the rules. The teams exploit the details. But when the details are unclear, the fastest team is often the one brave enough to step into the gray area first. Mercedes may have done exactly that. And before Monaco, the FIA's new evidence threatens to reveal whether that gray area has finally been closed, or whether the silver arrows are still hiding their sharpest weapon in plain sight. But the leak changed everything. Before that moment, this was the kind of advantage that could live quietly inside a factory. The kind engineers discuss behind closed doors. The kind rival teams suspect, but cannot prove. The kind that shows up in little details: better acceleration out of corners, stronger speed at the end of a straight, a car that seems to recover from imperfect exits just a little too easily. And in Formula One, that is usually how secrets appear first. Not as a confession. Not as a document. But as a pattern. A Mercedes-powered car looks stronger than expected. Then another one does. Then a rival looks at the GPS traces and starts asking why the difference keeps appearing in the same places. Then someone inside the paddock hears a phrase: thermal expansion, compression ratio, hot measurement. And suddenly, what looked like normal performance becomes something much more serious. According to the source material, the controversy exploded after a technical leak in December of 2025, weeks before the season began. That leak pointed directly at the idea that Mercedes had found a way to use heat itself as part of the engine's behavior. And the timing was brutal. Because by December, the other manufacturers were not at the beginning of their engine programs. They were deep into them. Ferrari had already committed to its architecture. Honda had already built its direction for Aston Martin. Audi was preparing for its new era with a power unit that could not simply be redesigned overnight. Red Bull Powertrains had its own version of the idea, but according to the source material, it was not believed to be as effective as Mercedes' version. That is when suspicion turned into anger. Because this was not just about discovering that Mercedes had something clever. It was about discovering it too late. Too late to copy. Too late to redesign safely. Too late to arrive in Australia with an answer. And that is the difference between a normal technical fight and a regulatory crisis. If a rival brings a new front wing, you study it. If a rival finds a better suspension concept, you try to understand it. If a rival improves tire management, you chase it with setup, simulation, and development. But if a rival builds an advantage into the internal geometry of the engine, using materials selected months or years earlier, you are not chasing a part. You are chasing a decision that was made long before you knew you were behind. That is why Ferrari, Honda, Audi, and Red Bull did not simply complain in public. They pressured the FIA. They wanted the governing body to close the door before the season could be shaped by something they believed violated the spirit of the rules. And the phrase that mattered most was simple. The car should respect the compression limit at all times. Not just when it is cold. Not just when it is convenient. Not just when it is sitting still for inspection. At all times. That phrase became the emotional center of the whole fight. Because to the rivals, the idea of a cold legal engine and a hot performance engine felt like a trick that turned the rulebook into a technical hiding place. But to Mercedes, the argument was very different. The written rule set the limit. The engine passed the written measurement. The regulation did not clearly define the missing condition. And in Formula One, if the rule does not forbid something clearly, the smartest teams will always ask whether it is allowed. That is not new. That is the DNA of the sport. The greatest cars in Formula One history were not built only by reading what the rules allowed. They were built by reading what the rules forgot. And this was exactly the problem the FIA now faced. If it banned the Mercedes concept immediately, it risked punishing a team for exploiting a gap the regulations had failed to close. That would have created a legal and sporting earthquake. Mercedes would argue that it had designed within the written words. Its customer teams would be dragged into the same problem. McLaren, Williams, Alpine, and Mercedes itself would all face the possibility of power units suddenly falling under suspicion before the season had even properly started. But if the FIA allowed the engines to race, Ferrari, Honda, and Audi would see the opening races as compromised before the first lights went out. That is the impossible position. Punish Mercedes, and the FIA admits the rule was not strong enough. Protect Mercedes, and the FIA looks like it is blessing a loophole. Either way, somebody leaves furious. And that is why the January decision became so important. According to the source material, after an emergency meeting with the constructors, the FIA concluded that the disputed engine technically complied with the regulation as written. That did not calm the paddock. It sharpened the divide. Because the phrase technically complied is not the same as saying everyone believed it was fair. It means Mercedes had survived the first legal battle. It means the trick, at least for the opening phase of the season, was alive. And once that happened, every early race carried an invisible argument. When a Mercedes-powered car looked strong in a straight line, rivals saw confirmation. When Mercedes minimized the gain, rivals heard damage control. When independent estimates suggested the advantage could be worth more than a token amount of power, the political pressure grew. And the numbers became part of the war. Mercedes could say the difference was only a few horsepower. Rivals and analysts could suggest it was closer to something that mattered on the stopwatch. But the exact number almost became less important than the principle. Because even a small edge at this level can be enormous. One extra step of acceleration can protect a position. One cleaner deployment phase can make an overtake possible. One little margin can allow a team to run a setup that others cannot risk. That is why the other manufacturers were not fighting over theory. They were fighting over race shape. Over tire stress. Over qualifying gaps. Over the points that disappear when a rival has just enough extra power to turn pressure into control. And then came the compromise. The FIA could not simply erase the problem. So it created a timeline. Cold measurements would remain for the first part of the season. Then, from June, the engines would face both cold and hot verification. And later, the hot standard would become the permanent reference. On the surface, that sounds like a fair solution. A transition. A correction. A way to close the loophole without blowing up the season overnight. But here is the uncomfortable part. A delayed correction is still a gift to the team that was already prepared. Because Mercedes knew the clock. Mercedes knew the deadline. Mercedes knew that if it could survive until the hot checks arrived, it would not be entering the unknown. It would be entering a test it had months to prepare for. And that is why the rumor of a Monaco specification became so powerful. The question was no longer whether Mercedes had used the loophole early. The question became whether Mercedes had already designed the next version of the loophole before rivals finished celebrating the rule change. That possibility is what made the FIA's new evidence so tense. Because the evidence would not only show whether Mercedes had crossed the line, it would show whether the line itself had been drawn in the right place. If the FIA measured the engine hot and found it over the limit, the rivals could say they were right from the beginning. They could say the car was only legal under an incomplete test. They could say the advantage should never have been allowed to influence the early races. But if the FIA measured it hot and Mercedes passed, the story would not automatically end. Because rivals would still ask the deeper question. Was 130 degrees the correct condition? Does that temperature match the real moment when the advantage appears? Could the engine behave differently at another point in its operating window? And most dangerously, did Mercedes design the engine not just to pass the rule, but to pass the rule at the exact temperature chosen by the FIA?